Welcome everybody. My name is Jonathan Lowell. I'm the community liaison for Planet Texas, a project that looks at sort of network analysis of environmental nonprofits across the state of Texas. So looking at not only uncovering disparities around environmental hazards and injustices, but also looking at ways for collaboration. And we have present, I guess I'll quickly introduce all our speakers. We have Natalia Ruiz, who is at the Center of Transportation Research. Deidre Zoll is a PhD student at the Community and Regional Planning. Jamie Walenta and Caroline Faria from the Department of Geography. And Patrick Bixler and is G here as well from the LBJ school. I hope, I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I think in the spirit of what we are uncovering, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement as requested by the Native American Indigenous Studies at UT. So I will read the statement that they devised. So we would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama Usada, Caddo, Riso, Comecrudo, Coyawiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Pancawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become of these lands and territories in Texas. And in recognition of the ongoing and cumulative challenges faced by indigenous peoples in Central Texas and globally, we call upon the University of Texas at Austin to repatriate the ancestral remains held at the Texas Archaeological Research Lab to their indigenous descendant communities and native lands, to commit to the active recruitment and material support of Native American and indigenous students who currently comprise fewer than 0.2% of UT Austin's student body, and to support the transition of the program in Native American and indigenous studies into a center, and to establish a protocol of research and study on tribal or native lands, and to foster an ethics and practice of engaged scholarship within four indigenous peoples and communities locally and internationally. And with that, thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it over. Oh gosh, I'm actually blanking on the order. Is it Deidre first? No, who is going first? Natalia.
I think I was going last. I don't mind going first though. Let me move to the beginning. Hi everyone, can you see my screen? Great.
Yes.
So thank you very much. My name is Natalia Ruiz. I work with the Center for Transportation Research, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing in the context of our project that relates to transportation-related air pollution and health. We have a quite large team, and we've been working together on and off. And I want to share some of the work we've been doing more recently. So broadly speaking, the goal of our project was just to enable the study of the relationship between transportation-related air pollution and health. There was a bit of a shift in focus from the beginning of the project. There was a change of PI. The former PI moved to a different university. So at the beginning, the goal was mostly to study air pollution using mobile sensors. And that's something that was continued by Josh Apti, who is also no longer at UT this year. But to do so, we were looking at collecting data using cars. And in that way, we could collect air quality data at a very fine level of spatial resolution, which is often not available. Usually air quality data is collected by a few sensors in town, and it's very hard to understand then how air quality changes spatially. So while that continued to be an area of research based on a data set that was collected at the beginning of year one, and that's been continued by Jonathan Gringit Gingrich, sorry, I'm terrible. We moved a little bit, we shift a little bit the focus on exploring other data sources that could be used to support this type of research. When my team came in as leading this effort, and we tried to compile a large set of data sources that could support the study of the topic, and I hosted a hackathon to try to bring awareness about the problem, and try to bring awareness about also the resources available at UT that could support further research on this area. And then these last few months, we had a couple of students, one from civil engineering and one from community and regional planning, also trying to see if the data sources that we identified earlier on this year could be used to understand the impacts of the COVID related lockdown on TRAP, and if there was any spatial disparities that we could detect using the data sources that we had identified. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to present some of what we did for this hackathon, this data compilation effort, and this community outreach effort, and then some of the findings of the students working on the before and after lockdown TRAP analysis. So the goal of doing this hackathon was not so much to get some necessarily concrete working product, but to bring awareness of TRAP and the health implications and the tools that are available at UT to potentially look at this problem. We wanted to share the data that we were able to compile, and also access to computing resources that are being developed as part of PT 2050. And of course, if possible, get groups to collaborate and develop tools and ideas to quantify the problem, communicate its impact to the community and to different stakeholders, and eventually propose solutions. So we had 4 different working tracks. One more focused on data visualization, another one focused on the networking of sensors and sensors interfaces using some tools provided by the Texas Advanced Computing Center, and another one focused on data analysis and problem solving. The target audience was really broad. Most of the participants ended up being students, but we also had some participants from the community. And so we wanted to have different working tracks that could accommodate different levels of skills. So this was not just for expert programmers. We wanted to be able to also involve and engage students that may not have a super strong technical background on programming, but that understood very well some of the social and equity issues that come with transportation related air pollution. There we go. So as I said before, our team was pretty broad. So I am from the Center for Transportation Research. We work with the Texas Advanced Computing Center. There were 2 groups from the civil and environmental engineering department. We worked with Elizabeth Matsui from the Medical School. Patrick Bixler from the LBJ School contributed some data. And then the GABA, it's a community advocacy group, and that's striving to help organize communities to mitigate somewhat the impacts of unequal access to healthcare, and the City of Austin Office of Sustainability that works with GABA in some of these issues. So as part of this, because we wanted this hackathon to have like a dual purpose, part of it was education, part of it was outreach, and part of it was, if possible, find out some solutions or some insights into the problem. We had a morning of presentations by different members of our team. So the City of Austin and GABA presented about the problems currently faced in the area that they were mostly working actively now, which is here in Dove Springs. And in this case, they're showing the incidence of asthma based on some modeling results. But they discussed the problem, their approach, potential solutions, and the City of Austin also participated by discussing some of the the approaches that sometimes they use to understand the problem and some of the challenges that they face. Then Jonathan Gingrich and Hagen Fritz presenting how different models, methods to monitor outdoor air pollution, and this involved what I mentioned earlier, these mobile sensors and the data sample collected by Josh Shapty and Jonathan at the beginning of this project using a Google car. And then Hagen discussed the deployment of a network of low-cost air pollution sensors that him, supervised by Zoltan Nagy, have deployed in the UT campus. And then Elizabeth Matsui presented gave a very nice overview of how to approach the problem of trying to find a causality between air pollution or any environmental factor actually and health outcomes. And it was very interesting for all participants to understand that it's a very hard and difficult problem to quantify, and that's actually something that became apparent in the research conducted in the context of this project, and she gave a great overview to make participants aware that it's not as simple as having two data sets and trying to find that correlation. It's much more involved than that, and that's what makes it so challenging. And then Jamie Powell from TAC made a presentation to describe some of the resources that are available through TAC in the context of the Planet Texas 2050 project, including DataX, which is a science gateway. And so, as a matter of fact, we posted some of our data sets in DataX just to make people familiar with this resource and how they can get access and how they can use it to share research data. So in terms of the data sets that we compiled 4 types of data sets: transportation, health, air pollution, and some other related data sets that we were hoping that people were going to use in their analysis. One interesting data set was the health data set. So through Elizabeth, we contacted Data Core in the Dell Medical School, and they were able to create some health outcomes and data and provided at the level that personal identifiable information was not compromised, which is very, very tricky for health data. So we had a combined data set that include, for the same time period in the same area, some health outcomes, some transportation data, some air pollution data, and some related data that could be used to support the analysis. We also deployed some air quality sensors in the Dove Spring area at some schools and public libraries in order to complement the network that had already been started by Zoltan Nagy. And we provide, as I mentioned earlier, data access in different ways, including DataX, which is this environment developed in the context of Planet Texas 2050. So we had 90 people registered and about 60 that showed up and actually stayed throughout the day. We had 4 winners. They analyzed multiple data sets. One challenge that we realized, there was a lot of data. Some of the data sets were quite complex. So the participants were kind of shy to use the more complex data sets. And so they used a subset only of the data that we had. And we're still planning to make this data available if students are interested, because it may require a longer term commitment to look at this data and try to make sense of it. So this was what we did in terms of compiling a data set and sharing it. And we felt that the hackathon was successful. It generated a lot of interest. The products themselves were nice prototypes. None of that is, of course, groundbreaking research. They had very little time to work on the problem. It was a great learning experience for us, understanding the challenges and the availability of data to understand the problem in the Austin area. And we are hoping that those data sets are going to be useful for future projects. So one example of that is we already had compiled data sets, and we had some students in the civil engineering department and community and regional planning that were working on a class project for a statistical consulting class, and they were interested in analyzing the impacts of COVID from the perspective of transportation and regional planning. So they wanted to explore 3 questions: whether we could see a difference in air pollution between January and May, if that impact was different in the Dove Spring areas than it was in the UT campus area, and if they could find some correlation. So if we could attribute that impact to a reduction in traffic. And I'm going to jump directly to the findings. There was no a strong correlation between air quality, neither between air quality and traffic data, nor between air quality and the lockdown. And this reflects some other studies that have shown kind of like, even though we were expecting to see better air quality, at least from the perspective of the sensor that we've been using, there hasn't been a huge change. We were able to see, of course, the impact of the lockdown on traffic, particularly on big thoroughfares like I-35, major freeways. On arterial, the problem was much more complicated, probably because of the data that we used. We used a data set that's proprietary. It's called INRIX. It has 1 minute data for small segments of roadways. But on arterial streets where we have traffic signals, it's trickier to assess changes in travel time because they're related not only, it's not continuous movement traffic, so the traffic signal timing plans and the queues are really not well captured by these data sets. And so this is the data that was analyzed, a subset of the sensors that are in the UT campus area and the sensors in the Dove Spring area. And this is an example of the segments on which traffic data was analyzed. And this includes a segment in Guadalupe, some segments in Dinquiro, and this is in the UT campus area. And for these segments, we had 1 minute traffic speeds data. And this is some of the results for the traffic speed data. So this is traffic speed in the vertical axis and time in the horizontal axis. And in the UT campus area, we don't see a big change as March goes by. On I-35, we do. So you can see that the speeds remain much better for a couple of weeks. Then they start following again the typical pattern. So when the speeds go down, it's your peak period, and when they go up, usually the lower is the PM peak, and this one is the AM peak. So we see this pattern before the lockdown. It almost goes away for a couple of weeks, and then it goes back. No change visible in the Dove Springs area. And this is a visualization of the purple layer. These are the low-cost sensors that were deployed. Blue is good, red is bad, yellow is intermediate. There's not a clear pattern before and after the lockdown or between the Dove Spring area or the UT area. And this is consistent with previous findings by George Apte's team and Zoltan's team, that it's hard to correlate this data to transportation related air pollution because of the nature of the data, basically. So in summary, this project was a great opportunity to gain further insight into the challenges of studying these correlations and the challenges of obtaining data that can be used for general research. It was a great opportunity to explore the use of some of the resources available at UT to collect and share data. It provided insights into the benefits and limitations of some of the air quality data that we can obtain from these low-cost sensors, and some better understanding of the air quality data in Austin. And with the work that we conducted towards this project, we're hoping to have a stronger position to participate, to go for some funding opportunities through NSF, including the SMART and Connected Communities. We already have a small role we participated in one of these grants, and we're hoping to be able to go for a second one that's more specific to the transportation field. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions now or later.
you, Natalia. I think we'll go ahead and let Patrick and team present, and then we'll have questions at the end. But feel free to type in the chat if you have any.
How's that looking? Is that showing my notes or showing the screen?
Just the screen. You're
Perfect.
Okay.
Right.
All right, thanks, guys. I'm going to kick it off. I'm Jamie. So one of the aims of Planet Texas is to identify solutions to make our state more resilient and better prepared for future environmental and population growth challenges. And our research contributes to this mission through the study of environmental NGOs and the role that they play in securing resiliency and equity. And this includes organizations like Go Austin, Vamos Austin, which mobilizes community power, which mobilizes to sort of empower the community to respond to inequities and access to food, water, and healthcare. So broadly, what we did is we asked this question: what role do ENGOs play in preparing Texas for a future that is environmentally resilient, but also socially equitable? And to answer this question, we assembled an interdisciplinary team composed of faculty at the LBJ School, as well as COLA. It includes collaborators with Planet Texas, but also UT libraries. And we also drew together a diverse team of graduate and undergraduate students. Now, to undertake our research, we engaged two primary tasks. The first one was to inventory all the ENGOs that operate in Texas. And second, to survey those organizations to document their existing networks, but also their policy agendas and the approaches that they take towards resilience and equity. And we're excited to share with you guys our preliminary findings and discuss our next steps. So next slide, please.
Cool. Thank you so much for laying the groundwork, Jamie. And I guess just first a reflection. This is so cool, and the vast variety of projects that have been conducted under the Planet Texas banner is just really neat. So we're just excited to be sharing our work with you today. First we want to acknowledge the incredible network of graduate research assistants and undergraduates that have worked on this project. No question that Yantao, Lucas, Kara, Dan, and Caitlin were the mass and velocity that kept the momentum of this project moving forward, before, but especially during COVID, and our undergraduate team that will be introduced here in a minute. Part of what we want to share today is a workflow that we've developed for governance network research. And I think this kind of methodological sort of innovation or workflow is genuinely a pretty neat contribution to the field that starts with a machine learning classification, followed by a snowball sampling approach, followed by the analysis of survey data. And kind of through this workflow, you're able to identify all the kind of relevant, not only environmental or sort of any sort of nonprofit that is substantively important to your research question, but how those nonprofits interact with public agencies. So this workflow really helps kind of answer the question: what is the population of organizations that are out there working in this specific area of interest to me? And for us, those of interest, we're generically calling environmental or ENGOs or environmental NGOs, but really more specifically, we crafted definitions around a subset of organizations that are quote unquote resilient relevant. And so as you'll see, that included a wide variety of equity oriented organizations as well that may not be your traditional environmental organizations. The first step to do this was to compile a raw organization list. We ended up compiling a list of around 14,000 nonprofits in the state of Texas that could potentially be relevant to our study. We did this by combining IRS 990. Nonprofits are required to fill out a 990 tax form, and that information is public record. So compiling IRS tax forms and other secondary databases that include information on nonprofits, such as from the National Center for Charitable Statistics. Why aren't we changing? So with that list of around 15,000, we had to identify what specific organizations in that list were relevant to our study. We did this through kind of a two-stage process. We used a machine learning classification algorithm to code program activities to identify those organizations that met some subset of resilience relevant. That equaled a list of about 705 environmental NGOs. And then we were also able just to take this NTE code of C, which is an environment organization, which generated an additional 798 nonprofits. So our original list included about 1,500 resilient relevant NGOs across the state of Texas. What that generated was kind of a data set that included all these data fields. And so from this list of 1,500, we had to figure out how to get a survey to these organizations. So in particular, two fields in this kind of data set were important: the web address and the email. In the instances where we already had an email, that went straight to our population sample. If we only had a web address, we used a Google API algorithm to help try to pull some of the information we would need in order to send them a survey or find a valid and reliable email. And then we also ended up relying on quite a few manual web searches. Through these processes, we ended up with our survey sample. And after cleaning the data, we went from 1,500 to about 370 unique and valid organizational emails. So this was our initial sample. They received an invitation to participate in the survey. From that invitation to participate in the survey with a couple of reminder emails, we generated about a 21% response rate. But what we did next was take the responses from that initial round one. And part of what we're asking for in the survey is, who do you work with to advance resilience and equity goals? And so that generates a new list of organizations, of partners from the original sample. So we cross-reference that those nominated organizations, or these partners that were listed, we cross-reference that with our original sample and identified an additional 228 new and unique and valid organizational emails. So we have a round one, a round two. That equals a total sample size of around 600. And we had 198 nonprofits respond to our survey, which was about a 33% response rate. And for those of you who do kind of online surveys, is a respectable response rate for this type of study. So now we have a whole bunch of data from about 200 organizations. And our survey included questions around organizational demographics, so we can get a sense of what activities and kind of what functions these organizations are playing in the service of advancing resilience and equity. We asked quite a few questions around staff and leadership makeup. So here's an example of the kind of white, non-white leadership composition of organizations. We included questions regarding the organizational impacts of disasters. So has your organization been impacted by a disaster? You can see over 30% being impacted by flooding. We also were able to kind of, the timing of the survey asks about impacts of COVID, including kind of what specifically your organization has dealt with in response to COVID, such as shutting down operations, losing revenue, et cetera. I am going to, I'm going to post in the chat. I'm going to take a little pause here from the live presentation. In the chat, I'm posting some links to not only the expanded survey results, so you can kind of see like an appendix of each question, but also some interactive network diagrams that I'll get to here in a second. Our survey also included organizational perspectives towards resilience and equity. So for example, what is the primary way that organizations frame resilience? And so like this example is a ranked question. And so you can see how the majority of organizations primarily frame resilience as the persistence of relationships within a system to bounce back. And we can also, a whole series of questions, Likert type questions around kind of resilience and climate change, et cetera. So For example, 80% take specific actions or report taking specific actions to understanding the impacts of climate change. Similar set of questions around the perspective and orientation towards equity. So how are organizations framing equity? We saw more variation and less agreement in kind of a definition or an approach towards equity than we did with resilience. And then other questions like, for example, 60% prioritize environmental justice along the lines of race, which was quite less than those who prioritized along the lines of gender or disadvantaged communities. And then with the survey data set, we were able to generate a network of organizations and entities that are working across the state of Texas to advance resilience and equity goals. So from the survey sample of about 200, we identified an additional 600 organizations, municipal, county agencies, state agencies, universities, et cetera, that are connected to these organizations as they seek to advance these specific goals. You can see, while all the organizations we surveyed were based in Texas, they have partnerships across the entire country, even a couple of international partnerships. One of the things we've done, and one of the links I shared, is an interactive kind of network map that has additional information about each organization, each of the 800 organizations kind of in the network. And then we're also able to look at the networks by specifically by resilience and or by equity. And so when we start to ask the question, who do you work with to advance resilience goals? You go from 800 organizations in this broad network to about 373, kind of clustered around different municipal areas in the state, and primarily of NGOs in some municipal county. And then even less so when we, or less or lower, fewer organizations working to advance equity goals when you ask specifically about equity. One of the really interesting things here is you kind of see there is one cluster of organizations that are not well connected. It's a very a low density network overall, but there's one cluster of organizations that are all connected. And then there's a whole bunch of clusters that are kind of doing this equity work within their own little network, not connected to others. And so this map in particular is distinguished from the resilience and just the broad network by that fragmentation. We do have we're still working on this project. A couple of next steps are to build kind of a interactive website, web interface that has this catalog of environmental NGOs across Texas. And then also doing some exponential random graph modeling of this network data. I'm really trying to understand how those perceptions of equity or those perceptions of resilience drive network tie formation between these organizations. Our survey also included quite a bit of open-ended and qualitative information. I'm going to hand it off to Anya to talk about the qualitative data coding they've been working on.
Hi, I'm Anya Krishnaswamy. I'm a part of the Feminist Geography Collective. We had 4 other undergraduate students work on this portion of the project: Lynn Huynh, Jesse Yin, Alyssa Ramirez, and Sarah Flynn. Our team analyzed the survey's qualitative data in the context of the study's interest in both ENGO engagement with resilience and with equity. We were particularly interested in which ENGOs consider perspectives that advance anti-racist environmental agendas. The way we understood the organization's response to resilience was we categorized it into 3 distinct sections. The first section measured the lengths the organization would go to achieve resilience. Reactive was responding to changes, proactive was making amendments to prevent problems, and dealing with COVID were organizations changing in light of the pandemic. The second section expressed how the organizations express resilience through ensuring financial planning, sustaining the environment, being conscientious of communities and equity, or vague responses. The third section were organizations that did not define resilience. For equity, we categorized the definitions into 5 sections. Our first category was no answer, and our second was blanket statements, which alluded to diversity and inclusion, but without any further elaboration. Our third category, equity framework, embodied equity-based practice with specifications in racial, economic, or resource-based, health, ecological, geographic, and intersectional equity. Our final two categories were work in progress, where organizations said they were in the process of building an equity-based framework, and apathetic or adverse responses, which admitted a lack of practicing equity. 3/4 of the organizations stated that they considered resilience in their practice. Resilience was identified as the ability of systems to absorb changes and return to a steady state. For resilience, many organizations understood it as financial planning within their own structure, or in terms of how well they can respond to changes within the system, preserving economic resilience over community. With respect to equity, we found that 70% of organizations consider equity in their practice. The top approach aligns with distributional justice, that is, identifying and responding to equities around resource access or the distribution of environmental harm. While the least selected approach was recognitional justice, which integrates diverse environmental perspectives into everyday practice. For equity, many organizations claimed they were equitable because their resources are technically available to everyone, instead of actively practicing an anti-racist framework. Many lacked intersectionality, and very few mentioned prioritizing by POC access to land or to food. For our next steps, we will be selecting a few organizations to interview, like One Star Foundation or Go Austin, Vamos Austin. We will be interviewing organizations that have a well-developed equity framework and connecting them to organizations that are still trying to develop a framework that pursues anti-racist environmental activities. Through these interviews, we can better understand how UT researchers and Planet Texas can serve their needs.
Sorry, I was muted. In addition to interviewing, we plan a research findings virtual meeting in the spring to communicate our results to participating ENGOs, but also to further strengthen collaboration opportunities between Planet Texas and the nonprofit community. All right, thank you, everyone. We also just very briefly wanted to express our overwhelming gratitude to the Planet Texas program and our amazing graduate and undergraduate students, and of course, our favorite project outputs, Sadie Shensky and Coco Ma. And we're happy to move on to questions now.
Great, thank you all. Yes, we are now open for questions, and technically have about 7 minutes, but I know Allison and me, we can stick around a little bit longer, and people can peel off as they need to. So yeah, is there any questions from the gallery, or for any of the presenters have questions for each other? Well, I have a question for the ENGO team. I'm wondering if there's like a sampling error in terms of organizations that practice equity more thoroughly are perhaps the ones most likely to be resource stressed and time, especially the resource of time, and therefore less able to fill out a survey or participate. I'm wondering, or I'm not if that's a fair assumption or not, but if there's any sort of like general sampling error in terms of like getting the picture of the landscape.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, it would be like another way to frame that is, what are the characteristics of the organizations that didn't respond to the survey, but were sent the opportunity to? And is there, a clear pattern in that? Is there sampling bias or response bias? And then the other thing to consider, is that whole network of the 800 organizations that we've now identified. If you were to continue our workflow another step or two, right, you could send the survey out to additional organizations that were identified in round 3. Ideally, and we've done this with some other projects, you would continue that kind of snowball until you had a saturation, and kind of a rule of thumb I've used in the past is sort of a less than 10% new organizations being identified. And so that, I think there's some sampling, there's sampling questions and methodological challenges for both the survey respondents, and then also, really the ability to construct a whole network of who's out there. And I just reiterated or re-asked your questions in a different way. I don't really have an answer. I think, what you asked and the way you framed, is certainly likely around the time and resources needed to respond to a survey and what they're focused on. I think, right, there could be a tie there.
It is something that we did think about as well, particularly in using 990 forms to first identify these organizations, recognizing that some organizations might not formalize their activities with the state. So for example, I don't believe we contacted and communicated with any mutual aid organizations. So it is something we grappled with and continue to grapple with. In terms of how to reach out to those orgs that try to keep a lower profile or keep a lower profile because of a lack of resources.
Thank you. Caroline has her hand raised.
Hi, thanks so much, everybody. I have a question for Deirdre. The critiques that the communities you worked with raised around equity work sound so familiar. And I was wondering if they shared with you strategies for maybe getting resources up front before they invest all this time and work with the city, or other tactics that they had that they might have shared about how to work with the city in ways that benefit them more concretely.
Yeah, there was a number of things that came up along those lines. One was sort of this just general question of, do we actually keep putting efforts here? Either like they're not going to go anywhere, or our time and money could be much better spent just working in our community. So that was a thing that came up from multiple people of just this, like, why do we keep being involved in this process? This has been on, it's not just this, but it's been ongoing for decades of trying to get communities involved. So there was that question. And then there was a bunch of sort of side networking that was happening and when they were developing the plan. Between these groups who were unhappy with the way the process was happening, and then sort of strategizing outside of the formal process of what can we do to influence that, maybe not directly in this equity working group, but how do we organize our constituents to try and push the city further than it might want to go. So that was happening as well. And then there were other folks that were saying, we could just sort of ditch out of participating with the city, but we would lose out. That we want to have a voice at the table, regardless of if they actually listen to us or implement what we're bringing up, that the consequences of not being there are greater than the time wasted of not having this kind of go we want it to go. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that was sort of the three trajectories.
It does. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I'll chime in with one that I think, or I suspect several of the researchers have thought about. I've been very fortunate over the last few months to have conversations with some Planet Texas folks about the meaning behind resilience and how it's been problematized by critical theorists, by communities working on advancing climate justice. And so I'm just curious, given that it seems like to some degree all projects engage that as a concept, both through the research and the engagement, I'm wondering if those conversations came up at all in your process.
Yeah, I mean, I could just say that we did have very explicit conversations during survey design around how to approach that, but really trying to frame the questions as a, having that what his resilience mean to organizations as a research question in and of itself. And so while we had, a series of those ranking questions, those came after they were asked to kind of self-define, does your organization, I think there was a couple of questions, do you have a working definition, and if so, kind of what is it? So really, I think there's, and as part of the qualitative kind of coding process, is trying to articulate from the ground up or grounded theory approach, you know, how are folks talking about this from the organizational perspective. But I think also being careful, right? We're not talking about, and I think we were clear on this, we're not talking about organizational resilience. Are you financially soluble? Are you, you know, how do you build resilience in your community?
And just from our project, Miriam, it's interesting, right? So in San Antonio, it's focused on a climate action and adaptation plan, and in Houston, it's an actual resilience plan. And at least from folks that we've interviewed so far, you see people kind of taking up the language of whatever process they're participating in. So resilience wasn't a word that came up in any of the interviews with folks in San Antonio, except for with the sustainability director, but it was on the lips of everyone in Houston. I'm not sure actually, like we didn't ask the question of how you define that. We asked questions about equity, but if it actually makes a difference for folks, right, in terms of the way that they're thinking about these issues. So I don't know that, but it was interesting to see the transference between what process they're participating in and then what vocabulary folks use.
Alyssa Ramirez, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. Hi, my name is Alyssa Ramirez. I'm one of the undergraduates that worked on the project. And my question is for Natalia Ruiz. I believe that you had mentioned how there was not much differences pre-quarantine and after quarantines in terms of the air quality, and that it was difficult to determine if it was related to traffic due to simply just the nature of the data. Despite this, my question is, what do you expect the future trends will be based on the patterns observed?
Well, because we haven't really found out a huge pattern, it's hard to anticipate future trends. We're looking now at some different data sets concerning from connected vehicles for traffic data. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to correlate those more with socioeconomic factors. And so we're trying to use some machine learning methods to understand in which areas we see an increase or a decrease in trip productions and trip attractions, and how do they relate to socioeconomic factors. In that way, we can expect to maybe predict to some extent what could be future trends if the lockdown continues and which areas may be more affected. The data that we looked at right now is really data from a high level. So we're just looking at the impacts on traffic, but not why they're happening. And so it's very hard to detangle the causality enough to make like predictions. And as I said before, the trends are not super strong. We just saw a couple of weeks of significantly better speeds on I-35, but nothing, not even for a longer time period. So yeah, that's what I can say for now. In terms of the air quality, it's not my area of expertise. From my discussion with Zoltan, Nagy, and George Apti's team, it's not unexpected that we were not able to see a trend. It doesn't mean that it does not exist, but it's the data source that we have right now. It may not be able to capture it. And they have some theories about the specific pollutants that we're looking at and how they may not vary too much in space and time. And that may be the reason why we're not capturing some of these differences. But they may be able to talk more in terms of what they will expect in terms of future trends.
Thank you so much for that distinction.
There's no more questions. I have one more question. I was wondering if the people in the Feminist Geography Collective could speak a little more about like what what that is and what it's like, and sort of like, I don't know, kind of what the experience of being part of that collective is like. If there's any volunteers in either from the undergrads or from Caroline.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anya, do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So I am not as well versed as Alyssa and Sarah because I just joined it, but so far, it's this very like small group of not just undergraduates, but also PhD candidates, and we have a lot of guest speakers who are like well versed in geography, and it's we get a lot of research opportunities provided to us. It's a very, very neat community. It's my only experience with the Feminist Geography Collective has been on Zoom because I just joined it a few months ago, but it's provided a lot of great opportunities. Alyssa and Sarah might be able to speak a little more on it though, because they were there last year too.
Yeah, just I guess in conjunction with Anya's, it is a very interesting group that facilitates and fosters research initiatives that if I have not honestly joined this group, I would not have been involved with as many of these amazing projects as before. And we are able to, complicate the narratives of what we want to be expected and what we want to be. And not only that, in Caroline and all the professors like Jamie and Rebecca does an amazing job of making sure that we are connected and are always do this as a very kind of like peer-reviewed and close relationships between each other, so we can always learn and grow from each other. And it's so like I'm so thankful to be able to have the opportunity to even be able to be here now and to be with them. And it is definitely like broadened my own experience despite my very short time at being at UT. And it is definitely like encouraged me to pursue more academic endeavors and to hopefully contribute more to the geography narratives that are so essential, and especially in nowadays. And I'm very, very glad to be here.
Thanks so much, you two. I can put a link into the chat. We're a feminist and anti-racist undergrad, grad, and faculty group in geography that work to support women of color in our discipline. And they're amazing, as you can see. Thanks for the question, Jonathan.
Well, we're about 8 minutes after 1, and people are kind of dropping off. If there are no questions, I'll give it a beat, or you can raise your hand. But thanks everyone for being here. I really appreciated all these new perspectives that we brought, and I hope that these are just building blocks to build to bigger things and deeper collaborations with folks engaged in equity and resilience across the state. So thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day. Have a great holiday, and talk to y'all soon. We'll be in touch.